Caddis Maximus here. This time this is a bit older review. This is actually not that old. This is a 2009, and Makita does date their tools, 6339D. This was the top of the line for Makita's NiCad and nickel metal hydride drills. This is actually the 14.4 volt version. They did have an 18 volt version, which would have, with a hammer drill function, which would have been the absolute best. This was replaced, or these were replaced with the 2-speed BHP 452s, the first generation of the lithium-ion drills. Now, right up through the early 2000s, Makitas were arguably easily one of the best, if not the best drills. They were the ones that you could bank on. They had been building up on the reputation of all their stick battery drills, and then they came out, and I really been into Makita drills for a long time, and many of my best cordless drills that I remember were Makitas, and then they seemed to kind of fall off some. I mean, I had a 6233D, which was what was the heavy-duty drill that replaced the stick battery drills, the first generation of the pod-style battery Makita drills. The half-inch version, 6333D. Then there was the 6336D, which was had the metal gearbox, and then they came out with the new generation, the 6337Ds. Those were like the last of the real popular pod battery Makita drills, and they were pretty good. A lot of people remember those because they were the ones that had the little switch on top that kept on breaking off that would allow you to quickly disengage or engage the clutch. This also has that same function. If you had the hammer drill, there would have been a center function for hammer drilling. And then right at the end of it, there were these, and these were awesome. You should also remember that Makita was the first to market with nickel metal hydride powered cordless tools, and they were first to market with lithium ion. They were really pushing that. Unfortunately, their push with these nickel metal hydride batteries they were terrible. They would work pretty good for a while, but after 6 months to a year, they weren't the low self-discharge type. They hadn't come out yet. Those type of nickel metal hydrides came out right around with lithium ion, so they just never got traction. And if they had low self-discharge batteries, these things would have been incredible. But instead, every one of these Makita drills I've ever found used in my life with a nickel metal hydride battery, the battery has essentially been kaput. Has just a little bit of energy in it, but that's just about it. They just internally wear out. It's really pretty unfortunate. This one has a little bit of energy. Always like that sound. And these were expensive. This was a $150 battery when it was new. This is the 3 amp hour. This is the highest rated battery. These drills with this 14 volt with this 3 amp battery was rated to drill about 8 to 10 2 9/16 holes through 2x4 lumber in low gear. I really like these because they did have a 3-speed transmission. It was 300 RPM, 600 RPM, so a high torque low gear, then a kind of a higher speed low gear, and then a 1700 RPM high gear. Now the BHP, their first generation of lithium-ion tools, were their 4-pole motors. That was the BHP 452. This is still a 2-pole motor, but it is a 2-piece motor, so it's not canned. There's a separate ring. It uses rare earth magnets. That's what the MXT is, Makita Extreme technology. And this was known as a 2-piece D31 motor, and it really used a lot of power. So as far as the power demonstrations, I'm not going to buy a battery to do that. But I've got basically a bunch of my power supplies all hooked together to give me about 14.1 volts and about 30 amps of output, and I'm going to go ahead and solder some 10 gauge wire to this and then give it a test. Now there was this was the era when lights were starting to be added to tools, and Makita got a lot of grief over this drill because it was when there were LED lights in cordless tools, and Makita didn't have it. And so what they did is the solution was on these really expensive 3 amp batteries. They had this little integrated footlight, and it was actually pretty neat because it could tilt out in multiple different positions. It had a little bellows that prevent crud from getting in there, and you just had a manual power light. The LEDs, as we can see, just weren't particularly bright, but I guess they helped a little bit. But I did like the feature that they were attached to the battery versus the tool, so that you could have an extra battery or just pull the battery out and just use it as a flashlight. When these batteries are good, I'm sure this flashlight probably lasted a week straight. It is a couple of pretty weak LED bulbs in there. The other issue was they had these battery cases are polycarbonate, but unfortunately they made it really thin on the upper portion, and when these drop, as you can see, there's cracks around the screw holes there and cracks here. And I tore down one of those batteries. They're 1.2 volt cells, so you'd have a dozen 1.2 volt cells to give you 14.4 volts. Well, the reason lithium-ion batteries, they're quoted at 3.7 volts, but they're 3.6 is because to follow the same kind of divisions that these types of cells had. So three 1.2 volt cells is 3.6 volts. That way lithium-ion could be put together to match many common voltages that were around with these types of batteries. One of the worst issues about these is we know on modern lithium-ion, they do balancing where the charger can actually has wires going to every single individual cell in the lithium-ion to make sure one battery doesn't get overcharged or is constantly being undercharged. The issue with these Makitas is there's 12 cells, but there's only one balancing point. So it's charging basically two 7.2 volt battery packs, and inevitably one of the cells starts getting weak and it has no way of compensating for it. And you get this behavior where it kind of runs good for like a couple seconds and then it just dies off. Really was just really unfortunate. People really got a bad taste in their mouth with how expensive these batteries were and to have them just go kaput. And this drill has been used, but just hasn't had that much time on it. And then, of course, here's our bottom case and the little LED that was inside there. And so these used to be what were just the best. And really nowadays you can buy a replacement battery off of Amazon for one of these, and I'd say go for it. Because they are really pretty heavy duty. I guess some of the issues really involved, particularly with this drill, was so heavy duty. Compared to all, like this is the era when Bosch came out with their 18 volt Brute Tough. They were the Milwaukee 18 volt M18 drills. I think they were called, maybe they were called the V18s, but these are always better. This housing, as we can see, is fiberglass reinforced polycarbonate. This was back when they were assembled in Buford, Georgia. And the funny thing about Buford, Georgia is that specifically was selected by Makita, I think in the 80s when they opened their first American factory, because it sounded American. It was pretty cheesy. But the issues I've seen with these is this switch will get locked out, just seize up. And I don't know why that is. And they also had issues with second gear wearing out. And I'll do a quick teardown to show about that. And the brushes would really overheat and crack and get stuck in the brush guides. I found quite a few Makita drills of this era, the 12, 14, 18 volt pod style, where they didn't operate just because the brushes had cracked and locked up. But these really were everything. They're huge, heavy. They use dual ball bearing spindles, so the spindle in this drill is just absolutely tight, just the same as a Milwaukee quarter drill or something, just as tight as it was from the day it came out of the box. But even with a drill like this, which will have a motor that can easily peak hundreds of watts of power, it's really surprising. They aren't as powerful as the more modern ones, and we can see how huge this is versus this DCD 996. Just quite a bit of shortening on the tool. Tons of power. Here's another example. This 3 amp 14.4 volt pod battery is a 42 watt hour battery. This is a 5 amp DeWalt, so that's a 100 watt hour battery. And we can see that they're about the same amount of volume, even though there's over twice as much energy in this battery. So anyway, I had an opportunity to run into this drill and picked it up used. It was only 15 bucks and wanted to do a review on my opinion that it was like the last of the 3-speed Makita drills, actually one of the few 3-speeds they ever made. And that was part of the reason I ended up with the DeWalt, is I had a 3-speed. That middle gear means actually quite a bit. Many times it turns out that middle speed can give you power plus additional speed. Although it was pretty slow on this. The big difference between this and something like this DeWalt is this is going to be 450 RPM and low, 300. This is going to be 1300 in second, a much higher speed second. This is only 600, and this is 2,000 and high, but that's only 1,700. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here is just do some basic drilling tests. I'll run a hole with this, and drive some big screws, maybe an auger bit, and I'll do some comparisons against that DeWalt just to see what a more modern tool can do. And I think given this 14 volts off of a combination of linear and CB or ham radio power supplies will be fair. 14 volts is probably what the battery's hitting when it's under full load anyway, and so it should be a reasonably fair test. This video will be weird because I'm going to do the teardown at the end, but that's why I'm going to be soldering the wires. I'm just doing the performance test in the middle. To make it all work, I have this 3 amp laboratory constant current linear power supply connected to this one. These are leading at 14.1 volts. I get about 10. This is a dual 3 amp I'm running in parallel, so that'd be 9, but they overrun a little bit, so I got about 10 amps. And this ham radio supply is running a little bit high, about 14 volts, actually almost exactly 14, but it's a 20 amp. And unfortunately, those batteries that's one thing I could say is those batteries are probably surging 40 to 50 amps, because I have 30 amps when I go full bore. The reason it behaves like that is the linear power supplies drive it continuously. When they drop the voltage, they'll still provide constant current, but that little black ham radio power supply is a switching supply, and so when it overloads, it turns off. So when I do this, it immediately overloads the whole system. The relays you can hear clicking are the benchtop power supplies, relays switching because of the voltage drop. But it goes slow, so they're driving it, and then the switching power supply is actually going into protection mode, shutting off, the motor speeding up. The other power supplies are kind of making it think that its loading is less, and it turns back on and finally delivers its power. This motor, which means this motor is using well over 30 amps. Think about that. 30 amps times 14 volts is like, what, 420 watts? No joke. 400 watts out of that little motor. So that was disappointing, but kind of nice in a way. Because it shows really that these drills did have some pretty darn stout motors in them. Probably too stout because the number of brushes that had overheated. But man, these were awesome. And I would have liked to get a nice demonstration, but I guess I didn't really anticipate needing a 50 amp 14.4 volt power supply to properly drive this. 40 or 50 amps easy, because it was just quickly and very easily overloading 30 amps worth of power. And I forgot to demonstrate, but after it all got up and running, I could tighten down the chuck and hold on to it and get it to go back into overload, so it just wouldn't have been a good demonstration at all. And even dug up this 10 gauge wire to deal with it. Anyway, that's the end of my kind of long and odd video, but there's only just a couple videos about this drill on YouTube, and this the 6439 and the 6449, and I think the hammer drill version of this was the 6349. Really, I think that as far as just raw build quality, except for the couple of issues they had with the gearboxes, probably the heaviest duty drills the Makita ever made. With the battery, I'm sure that they are physically the heaviest drills they ever made. The only one that would even compete with this in weight is this 12 volt stick battery drill. That was the stick battery drill that also had the big kick out. That thing was probably one of the world's largest cordless drills. But just really wish Makita was still was making tools like this, because I would still be a Makita person if they had a 3-speed drill that was, like this, polycarbonate body, just super duty. Anyway, on to the teardown. So I'm not going to use this battery anymore, that's for sure. Let's just do a quick teardown. Actually, I'm going to pull out this belt clip. It was always kind of funky getting these belt clips out of here, because you got to kind of wrench them back and forth. Let me fight with that. I'm actually just going to leave that in there, because these belt clips are difficult to get off. we will want to pull out these brushes. I did like the way the brushes were set up in these Makitas, just because they're pretty easy to deal with. They actually snapped in number 430s. They just snapped right in. And we can see that they're actually really nice copper impregnated brushes, big thick lead wire, really a pretty nice setup. They do have stamped brush guides, which isn't, you know, it's not the best, but it's okay for a cordless drill. But they did get too hot. These really would get burned up, especially people running these hard contractors and the like. Pull that out, and then we'll go and knock all these screws out. And here we are. Got to kind of loosen the front gear case a little bit, and then just get these two halves to want to nice and easily separate, as easily as they can, at least. There we go. And voila. Really, we're pretty nice back in this era. Like just the beginning of the era of tools using overmolding. We can actually see it's held up, at least on this one, pretty decent. But that body is actually surprisingly rigid. Even with the thin area around the trigger, really pretty heavy duty. And no brushless here, just a simple chopper circuit. It's all integrated into the trigger. So I need to get this open so I could solder the wires properly. There's just a huge gearbox in there, and there's our big D31 motor. The little chopper circuit is screwed to the housing of the permanent magnets, acting as a big heat sink. So that's pretty wise, and we'll just get this gearbox apart here. First, we'll show inside the motor. There's our gearbox. Definitely a little bit dirty. Now, if we can't get this motor housing off without damaging, oh, those bearings just pop right out of there. Ugh. Those are pretty strong. Those are rare earth magnets in there, but they're not hard drive magnets, but they definitely are pretty strong. Of course, we do have a ball bearing motor. Definitely pretty nice. It's sealed on both sides in the rear. It would be sealed on the back side on this front one, and this metal shielded because it would be inside the gearbox. But you can just see by the size of my fingers that the wiring, the windings on this are immensely thick. That is solid copper wire. I mean, it's huge. It's like at least a millimeter or something. That would be like 3/32 of an inch. I mean, this is some of the thickest windings I've ever seen in any brush type motor. And you can imagine wire that thick passes a lot of power. This isn't going to be the most detailed teardown. I mean, you kind of saw the important part, the motor. And I do want to get at this gearbox here. And this is always kind of funky. It's starting to come back to me. I did want to mention that there is a pretty large bowl gear right there at the end of the motor. Really a bigger diameter, it seems, than they are a lot of tools these days. Get out this first stage if I can. There's our first stage, and then our shim washer. And what I liked about this is that even though it's only 3 gears on the first stage, we can see that they have little brass bushings instead of just being steel and steel pins. And they are pretty massive. Definitely always appreciated that. But the issue was with the second gear in this 3-speed drill. We'll pull this out, and we can see part of, and that should stand up, is how they get the second speed is they have these 2-step gears. DeWalt does the same thing, but DeWalt did a patent to where their gearboxes are all held together with plates on both ends of all these pins. Makes the gears really straight, makes all the power get delivered in much more even fashion, I should say. And it really helps them take the power that they put out now without actually having particularly larger gears, just because they maintain essentially perfect alignment. Technically, the issue with these gears, or these pins, without being reinforced, which is basically in all cordless drills besides, the DeWalt's I've seen, but other high-end planetary gearboxes often have support plates on the backhand side, because when you're putting a lot of force here, technically these little pins will bend or deflect a little bit. That allows these gears to get deflected a little bit in their ring gear. And when that happens, they start wearing out more quickly. So in this drill, they're good, but I've seen used versions of these drills where the second gear was indeed stripped out. So 3 gears on the first stage, but really tall, and then we have 4 gears on the second stage. We'll pull out the ring gear, make sure it has a correct orientation. I probably should put this upside down just so I don't forget. Definitely pretty greasy in here. And then here's all of our gears, and what they actually are is 2 independent sets of gears that are able to rotate freely that sit on top of each other. And that issue is when you're in second gear. Let me go and pull the rest of this out. Before I get into second gear, it may be a little hard to see. There you go. We have 5 gears in the final stage. So that would make this a 12-gear gearbox. So pretty much all is really great. Although this one part, and this is where I've seen the stripping happen, is these little gears get stripped out because they're just sitting way up here on the post. So in second gear, you're just getting a lot of force. There's not a ton of support. And these posts really start deflecting over, and what happens is it just starts riding on one corner of the gear, and it means greatly increased pressure, localized high pressure area instead of being evenly distributed across the whole tooth or the whole gear, and so it allows that to grind down faster, and then that high pressure point just quickly works its way down. And it was always just the most unfortunate part is these were great, and it was particularly in the 18-volt drills because they had the exact same gearbox. That people who would use a second gear, which you really would on this because it was just 600 RPM, under a lot of heavy duty use would end up blowing out, and it was just kind of a shame. That and the batteries really were a disappointment. And even that Milwaukee M12 second generation brushless fuel compact half-inch drill had a pretty big gearbox. It had a 13 gear, so manufacturers have really learned their lesson. I mean, gosh, I was just kind of going off about that because this was at the time Makita's best drill they had ever made, period. And one of the most competitive on the market. I mean, they were good, but just not quite up to the level that you totally expect. Those darn batteries and these darn gears. Look. Anyway, I'm going to get soldering some wires. And that will be pretty much the end of this teardown and the whole long involved review of this little drill. But I kind of wanted to do a video on this. Tools that were around right at the beginning of YouTube or just before YouTube basically don't exist. There's only a few videos, although these were the tools that were the premium stuff. This thing with the 2 3-amp batteries, at the store in 2009 was probably a $350 drill set. No joke. $350 10 years ago. Maybe $300 for this would be, or something like that, and then like $350 or $400 if you got that. And then the 6935 FD, which was like the best impact driver with 103 foot-pounds of torque. That was a really pretty good impact driver, but it was Chinese made, and it just didn't have the nylon body. And my issue is then they went to 3-speed or 2 speeds with the BHP 452 4 poles, and then they went into their brushless series, and they're nice tools and powerful, but they've been focusing on trying to make them just as compact as possible, and it was a shame because Makita, if you guys go any of y'all look on websites or on Makita's website, you're just not going to find a cordless drill that's quite as heavy duty as what one of these was. There just isn't. You can buy the new LXTD, whatever it is, and I'm sure I could use this drill as a hammer to smash it apart. And I really wish Makita would come out with something just really nice. I mean, if they had something with a 3-speed like the DeWalt, I probably would be with Makita right now. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.